Hi everyone, hope all of you are doing super great, and in this video I'll be giving you some information on the factors influencing requirement prioritization. And again, this information is taken from the BABOK, and let's get into it without any delay. So there are several factors that influence prioritization. The very first one is benefits. So whenever you want to prioritize a requirement, basically you need to think about how this requirement is helping me. In what way am I getting value out of it? Okay, so the very first factor you can think about is what is the benefit. So, benefit in the sense, what is the advantage that accrues to stakeholders as a result of implementing a particular requirement. So this can be, in order to identify the value, you can measure this against the objectives and the goals of the change that you're trying to bring about, to see whether really this requirement is contributing to the objectives and the goals. If it is contributing, then you can say, yes, I am getting benefit out of implementing a requirement. So this could come from possible specific functionalities that you might be implementing. It could be that the requirement is satisfying certain desired quality. It could be aligning with a particular strategic goal or a business objective. The next one you would want to think about is the penalty. So, what is penalty? As we all know, it's the consequences that result from not implementing a given requirement. So, generally, these requirements are about prioritizing requirements in order to meet certain regulatory or policy demands imposed on an organization. So, whenever it comes to regulations, policy, and rules, security, compliance, all these are examples in which, where if you do not kind of implement these requirements, you actually have to face certain penalties. So the organization is sued with so much of non-compliance regulations, and then you have even costs that might be incurred. So generally, requirements that have a penalty associated to it, these requirements take up a priority more than what stakeholders feel to be beneficial. The next one is cost. So cost is the effort and resources that's needed to implement the requirement. Okay, so this information about cost, typically it comes from the implementation team or the vendor. So either the team says that this is going to cost us so much, or in case you need certain license infrastructure, you need certain softwares, then these are the costs that would come from vendors as well. So generally, customers, if they come to know about a particular cost, then they would kind of reprioritize requirements depending on what's more cost effective and feasible for them. The next one is, also another thing to keep in mind is cost can also be used in conjunction with other criterias such as cost and benefit analysis. So, whatever cost you're putting, what is the benefit that you are getting out of it? So, based on this, you can also prioritize requirements. The next one is risk. So, risk is the chance that the requirement cannot deliver the potential value or cannot meet at all. Okay, so that's a risk. So whenever there is a risk associated, it could be, for example, the risk is there is some difficulty in implementing a particular requirement, or there is a risk that stakeholders will not accept a solution, or even probably it's not even technically feasible. So in scenarios like this, when you feel that there's high risk, then maybe you would not want to prioritize that first. But let's say it's a high priority and there's so much of risk associated with it. In that time, you can go ahead with a proof of concept which can be developed first, at least in order to prove that there is a possibility of working on that requirement which has a high risk. And the next one is dependencies. So, as we all know, dependencies is the relationships between requirements where one requirement cannot be fulfilled unless the other requirement is fulfilled. So, if the other requirement that is dependent on a particular requirement has a high priority, then probably the dependent ones would also need to be prioritized as fast as possible. The next one is time sensitivity. So this is a very classic one, my favorite. So the best before date of a requirement, after which the implementation of the requirement loses significant value. So there are times, okay, when you need to kind of implement a requirement within a time period. So if you're just out of that time period, then there's just no use of implementing that feature. So I remember there was a time when, during the pandemic, and people were kind of, getting into a frenzy, and everyone were getting into virtual communication and virtual, ways of working. And communication tools were actually doing really good, where you can collaborate with teams and you can communicate and work on the fly. So let's say that was the scenario. So at that time, launching let's say a collaboration or communication tool would make sense. But later on, if you're not kind of, wanting to, if you feel that it needs to go later, probably you won't get much adoption as what you got it during the pandemic. And another example could be, if you want some features which are going to be highly used, especially during seasonal time, okay, at that time, then it makes more sense to implement these features more before a particular period or in a particular period, seasonal changes. So these are all best before dates requirements. So if that's the case, then you should be prioritizing these requirements based on that factor. The next one is stability. So the stability is the likelihood that the requirement will change. So generally, if a requirement is very stable, then you can easily be assured that there's certainty and you can go ahead with implementing. So if the requirement is not stable, it's very low, okay, then it will have a very low priority, and probably if you want to take up that requirement, then it's at your own risk, because still there's no certainty, you don't have enough of information, or there's no resources, or you didn't get the buy-in. So all these factors contribute to the stability. And the last one is regulatory or policy compliance. This is something similar to what we see into penalty, but here if you see requirements that must be implemented in order to meet regulatory and policy demands which are imposed on the organization. So if there's something that you need to comply with, then yes, there's no other way of escaping out of it. So those are the requirements that you should be prioritizing. And again, this type of a factor, requirements falling under these factors, regardless of what is the stakeholders, their interests and what they feel needs to be implemented, usually these type of requirements take up a higher priority. So these are some ways in which, or some factors that influence prioritization. So whenever you want to prioritize a requirement, think of these factors, and based on whatever factor your organization or your team is, kind of prioritizing on, it's best to get information about all these factors, so that whatever be the factor you're prioritizing on, it's going to be easy for you and your team also to come up with prioritizations. So I hope this information was useful. If you like this video, please do give this a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe to this channel, and also do share your feedbacks. Thank you.